Hello, students. This is Mr. Brown here. Today we're going to be talking about the earliest foundational civilizations. Where we last left off, about 10,000 years ago, the Neolithic Revolution or Agricultural Revolution took place. Uh, Settlements turned into villages, villages turned into towns, towns over time turned into cities, and in some of those places, advanced civilization really flourished. To start off, just to kind of give you a sequence, a very simplified sequence of events of who was around during this time period and who came first. I would like you to create a timeline, and you can title this in your notebook, Early River Valley Civilizations Timeline. Please, you can do this horizontally or vertically, honestly, but I do want some sort of timeline that just kind of shows the sequence of these different groups coming to be. So let's start off. Good starting point for this class is 8000 BCE or 10,000 years ago, the Neolithic Revolution, the birth of agriculture, settlement, especially once you get surplus agriculture, man, you see various civilizations really rooted in that. About 4000 BCE, you start to see the development of writing, bronze metalworking, the wheel, and the plow all starting in the Middle East, in an area of the Fertile Crescent that will one day be known as Mesopotamia. So the Stone Age is effectively over, and again, these dates are very much approximate. We have entered the Bronze Age. 3500 BCE, the Sumerian civilization develops in the region of Mesopotamia. We'll talk about this more, but Mesopotamia, rather than its own independent individual civilization, it's more of a group of civilizations that were all in the same general region. Mesopotamia is sometimes called the birthplace or the cradle of civilization, and the Sumerians are typically considered to be the true first civilization out there. 3000 BCE, approximate date, you've got the birth of ancient Egyptian civilization. 2500 BCE, you've got the birth of the Indus Valley civilization in South Asia. In East Asia, about 1700 BCE, you see China really kind of come to fruition as an advanced civilization under the rule of the Shang dynasty, the first real recognized dynasty in China. 1500 BC, other side of the globe in the Americas and Mesoamerica, you have the ancient Olmec civilization. And then finally, in 1200 BCE, you have the Chavan civilization of South America. There's a lot of different groups, guys. These are some of the big ones, some of the more prominent ones, some of the ones that really serve as the foundation for everybody after them. But by no means are these the only people on Earth at the time. These are the ones, though, that are the most noteworthy. So on the slide here, you see a world map that kind of highlights some of the areas that first really saw a rise in civilization. We'll kind of review them in sequential order, so look at your map key and follow along and see if you can locate these various places. Starting on the left-hand side in the burnt orange, we have Mesopotamia, the birthplace of civilization, the birthplace of a lot of innovations that, man, it's pretty amazing all the things that they came up with. This group of civilizations was centered around the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. You may recognize those names. They are referenced heavily in the Old Testament of the Bible. This is the general area that a lot of those events are believed to have taken place. Similarly, if you move a little bit to the west in northeastern Africa in blue, kind of a darker shade of blue, you will see the Nile River civilization of ancient Egypt. Known for their pyramids and their pharaohs and their hieroglyphic writing, Egypt is a that sounds weird, is a very interesting civilization to study. Moving further to the east in purple, and you see some arrows going between Mesopotamia and this place, we have the Indus River Valley. The Indus River Valley, again, was a group of civilizations, more so than a united civilization. The two most famous sites of this civilization were Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. And then moving even further to the east, in East Asia, we have the foundations of what will become China, centered around the Yangtze River, eventually the Yangtze further to the south, under the first real organized government there, the Shang Dynasty. Moving over to the Americas, we have the foundational kind of prototype of civilization in Mesoamerica. In the maroon, we have the Olmec. And then further to the south, we have in the Andes Mountains of South America, the Chavan. A couple other groups referenced. Papua New Guinea. Be honest with you, we're not going to talk about them much. Know that they were doing some things, that they were, certainly organizing themselves, and they early on kind of learned agriculture, but short of that, they're no longer really a part of the curriculum. The Hittites, warlike tribe centered around modern-day Anatolia or Turkey. They beat the heck out of a lot of the groups that we're going to talk about because they were believed to be the first group to use iron tools and weapons. But short of that, that's pretty much all we're going to say. You got the Babylonians, a burgeoning empire that rose out of Mesopotamia, ruled over the bulk of Mesopotamia for some time. We will reference them, but again, they're kind of lumped in with Mesopotamia. Other groups that get referenced during this time period, you have the Phoenicians in the Middle East, modern day Lebanon, great traders, great colonizers. They formed the city-state of Carthage in North Africa. They invented, what eventually becomes the alphabet, phonetic alphabet. It's named after the Phoenicians. And you've got the Hebrews of the Middle East, modern-day Israel. During this time period, most of these civilizations, if not all of these civilizations, were polytheistic. They believed in many gods. The Hebrew people, the earliest adherents of Judaism, were arguably the first to believe that there was just one God. They called him Yahweh, and many people believe that they are kind of the founders of monotheism, or the belief in one God. All of these civilizations had tremendous impact. I mean, they were the first of their kind. They were the first large states to have organized government and really assert their rule over a large geographic region. And while some of their contributions are more obvious than others, a lot of the themes that we will talk about in this class, things that we see in nearly all civilizations, they really do start during this time period. We previously talked about the concept of patriarchy, male-dominated societies. This is something you definitely see in really all of these civilizations to some degree. We talked about the concept the other day of social hierarchy, social stratification. Some of these societies had very strict social classes that determined just about everything a person could do, who they could associate with, what they could do for work, you name it. Whereas others, there was some social mobility and the lines between classes were a little bit more blurred. But social hierarchy as a concept, really gets cemented during this time period. Another thing that gets cemented is the idea of divine right. The idea that rulers are either chosen by the gods, that they are a god, that they have some sort of supernatural affiliation. This is something that a lot of early rulers, almost all early rulers, utilized to some extent to get their people to fall in line. The idea being it's easy to defy a man, a ruler, it's much less so to defy God. This is also the time period where you really see the birth of empires. You see the birth of conquest. stronger civilizations, trying to dominate their peers, their neighbors, for resources and wealth and manpower, you name it. This is the time period where a lot of those things really begin. And that's why this period's so important. It's not so much that it's going to be on the AP exam. It's not, although some of the stuff connected to it might be. It's that all of these trends that we see time and time again, history repeating itself, a lot of things you see in latter day civilizations, they really start during these early foundational civilizations. One last thing. You may note that most of these groups have something in common. Take a look at the map. Take a look at some of the things that I've described. Guys, almost all of them started in river valleys. Kind of makes sense. Rivers are a source of fresh water. They provide a transportation corridor. You know, you can float down the river, you can sail up it, you can trade, you can travel. That just kind of makes sense. You can get clay from the riverbanks to make your pottery to store food and water. You can, you know, hunt the animals that congregate near the rivers. You can fish. You can use the river for irrigation. Plus, specifically in these river valleys, when these rivers flooded every year, they brought in mineral-rich silt from the bottom of the rivers that served as a sort of fertilizer. It made for some very rich, fertile soil. So, you know, just that sort of geographic similarity gives you, you know, a starting point. So the first place we're going to start discussing is Mesopotamia, the region within the Fertile Crescent. You can see the Fertile Crescent in green, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Fertile Crescent gave birth to a lot of different civilizations in Mesopotamia, because rather than one united civilization for most of their history, Mesopotamia, or Greek for the land between the rivers, is more a collection of city-states that have similar cultures, but theoretically, you know, rule themselves independently. The word city-state is worth remembering. So this is the cradle of civilization. This is also the approximate region that the Neolithic Revolution first occurred 10,000 years ago. Which, if you think about it, kind of makes sense. The area that agriculture first got popularized, well, they kind of had a head start on settling down and building advanced civilizations. The Sumerians were the first group to populate this area and really rise to the point of advancement. Again, all those dots you see towards the southeastern part of the map, I mean, those represent independent city-states. Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, to name a few, Uruk, Ur. But really the Sumerians were the ones that laid the foundation for what a lot of Mesopotamia would be known for. A couple things to know about the Sumerians. They were the first foundational civilization. They arguably were the first, you know, really well-organized government that was created to coordinate the building of dams, canals, levees. They were the first to really come up with a taxation system. They were the first people ever, it is believed, to have written language. We'll talk about it here in a minute, cuneiform. These are the inventors of the wheel. These are the inventors of the sailboat. These are likely the inventors of metallurgy, of glassmaking, of the plow, of truly, you know, studying astronomy and identifying constellations. With their astronomical knowledge, they were the first to develop a 12-month calendar. They were the first to kind of develop this idea of kingship. The list goes on and on. They laid the foundation. Other groups in Mesopotamia kind of borrow a lot of their ideas and come up with some of their own. And then a lot of these ideas just inevitably spread to places like Egypt. But the Sumerians in Mesopotamia probably all started with them. The picture you see in the middle is a ziggurat. It is a common architectural feature that you would see in really all of the city-states of Mesopotamia, Sumer, so on and so forth. The people of Mesopotamia typically believed in the same gods, okay? They had a pantheon of deities that they believe created everything. Each city-state, though, had their own kind of patron god, one god that was kind of looking out for them. And these ziggurats, these religious temples, they were really built to honor these many gods. The people of Mesopotamia were kind of pessimistic in their belief system. They didn't believe so much in an afterlife, unlike the Egyptians that we'll talk about next. They believed that your behavior was going to be judged by the gods here on earth. If bad things happen to you, it's probably because you ticked the gods off. If good things happen to you, well, it's because you had earned the gods' respect. Originally, the governments in Mesopotamian city-states, priests held a lot of the power due to the devout nature of the religious beliefs of the people that lived there. But eventually, power shifted more towards kings. I'd said in the last slide, the idea of kingship originates here. And rather than just being, regular people, these kings often associated themselves with the gods, that they were chosen by the gods, that they were in some way otherworldly. In this slide, we see the four great empires of Mesopotamia. The empires, that were from Mesopotamia that really kind of ruled over almost its entirety for at least a time. In the upper left-hand corner, we have the Akkadian Empire that really flourished from about 2300 to 2100 BCE. Under Sargon the Great, this is arguably the first empire in all of human history. Why do empires begin anyway? I mean, why would you go out and conquer your neighbors? Well, first of all, you got to have the capability to do so. More manpower, more resources, better technology. But usually, the motivation for conquest is more wealth, more resources, better access to trade routes. These are constants really throughout all of world history. We next have the Babylonian Empire. From about 1792 to 1595 BCE, the Babylonians really flourished. They came up with a bunch of stuff themselves. They were, under their ruler Hammurabi, arguably the first group in Mesopotamia, or anywhere for that matter, to come up with a complete code of written law. We will discuss the Code of Hammurabi on an upcoming slide. You may have heard of the Assyrians, the next great empire to come in and really govern over the majority of this territory. From about 900 to 612 BCE, the Assyrians, using their violent war machine, their chariots that they were experts at fighting with, really dominated the region. Later, we have the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which is, the new Babylonian Empire, that also governed quite a bit of territory as well. Again, Mesopotamia is a group of civilizations, but at times, one of those groups did rule over almost everyone else. The thing about this territory, though, is there's few natural barriers to keep outsiders out. Eventually, groups like the Persians will come through and take over everything. Later, the Greeks under Alexander the Great will come through and take over everything. Later on, the Roman empires will come and take at least a good chunk of this territory. This is valuable real estate because it's at a crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. A lot of major trade routes will eventually run through this territory, and it is its physical location that makes it so valuable. One of the biggest innovations to come out of Mesopotamia was writing. And the first system of writing, it's definitely worth writing down, is cuneiform. Don't worry about the spelling. Cuneiform. This starts with the Sumerians, but soon is adopted throughout the region. It's very important, because once you have a system of writing, you can keep records. You can keep records of taxes paid, of the amounts of crops that are harvested each year. You can keep records of trade negotiations, and eventually you can record history. Everything up to this point is considered prehistoric because you don't have history until you have writing. But once you have writing, then we can start to see at least some historical record moving forward. In Mesopotamia, didn't have a whole lot of trees, so what they would write on, adapting to their environment, clay tablets. Now the thing about these clay tablets is you could only write on them while they were wet. Once they dried, it was pretty much, set in stone. Literally, that's where the saying to set something in stone comes from, because once the clay tablet dried, there was no changing it. Now, even though writing comes about during this time period for many, many years, most people will continue to not be able to read and write. This was a very specialized job for many years. These people were known as scribes. And if you think about it, a lot of English words come from the word scribe. If you go to the doctor and need some medicine, he's going to prescribe that to you. If you have maybe a ring or a piece of jewelry that you want a cool little message to your loved one on, well, that's an inscription. They inscribe that. If you're telling a story, you're describing something. Again, a lot of the things that we just take for granted, like they've always been there, even words, a lot of them go back all the way back to this time. One of the biggest things, though, that comes out of Mesopotamia, and there's a lot others, but I'm telling you, this is important to remember because so many civilizations will kind of pattern their laws, at least in part based on this, is the Code of Hammurabi. This is the first really comprehensive code of written law. And the best way to summarize this, and this is another saying you've probably heard of, an eye for an eye. It's very much based on punishment and retribution. If you knock somebody's eye out, theoretically, they get to knock your eye out. It doesn't work exactly like that, but that's the gist of it. Here we actually have a few, parts of the code. 195, if a son strikes his father, his hand shall be cut off. Kind of harsh, but hey, harsh times. 196, if a nobleman puts out the eye of another nobleman, his eye shall be put out. 197, if he breaks another nobleman's bone, his bone shall be broken. 198, if he puts out the eye of a commoner, he shall pay 1 silver. So, eye for an eye sounds good, kind of. At least it's equal, but it's really not. Because we're dealing with a very socially stratified society. We're dealing with a very patriarchal society. And it says here the basic idea was that criminals should be punished by having the same crime done to them. However, Hammurabi's code clearly treated different classes of people unequally. So they, through this law system, tried to bring about some order, but they also treated people differently based on the social class they were in, based on if they were a man or a woman. So they reinforced some of the really messed up ideas of the time. Next, we're moving on to our next civilization. We're going to northeastern Africa. We're going to talk about the Nile River civilization of ancient Egypt. There was trade between Egypt and Mesopotamia, undoubtedly, but they were very different culturally. In some ways, you can kind of equate it to their rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates were very vicious rivers. They would flood and people would die, and they were unpredictable. And maybe that kind of led to some of the beliefs of the people of Mesopotamia being a little bit more pessimistic. But the Nile River was calm. It was very predictable. It flooded the same time every year, and the people learned when it would flood, and they welcomed that because that would bring in the fertile soil. Uh, Growing crops was much easier, so it gave them more time to build and focus on other things. The ancient Egyptians definitely did their own thing, and they were kind of isolated for a lot of their history as well. You've got to understand surrounding the river. I mean, it's 90% desert. It's hard to invade. I mean, eventually different people do invade and rule over Egypt, but Egypt had a very long time to do their own thing, to come up with their own ideas. And we're looking at a civilization that was peaking, thousands of years before anything you can even associate with modern times. I mean, we're going back 5,000 years ago to the very beginnings. On the right-hand side, you see a very simplified version of the social hierarchy that you would have in Egypt. And like I said before, this is very indicative of what you would see most places. On the bottom, you have enslaved persons. Might be prisoners of war, might be specific groups of people that were identified for slavery. Slavery in all of its forms throughout history is purely evil, and it's based on greed. But unfortunately, it's something that we see time and time and time again throughout history amongst almost all of the prominent civilizations we will discuss. So at the bottom, you've got slaves. At the top, you have a god king. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt were considered to be more than men or women. They did have a few women pharaohs as well. They were seen as descendants of the gods, or perhaps even gods themselves. And because the pharaohs were the supreme political and religious leaders, they were honored and treated with the utmost respect. Egyptian history is super long. Again, you look at American history, we've been around since 1776 officially. Colonization obviously goes back quite a bit further than that. This is a time period it's hard for us to really even think about in our head, really how long Egypt was around, even though it was so long ago. Sometimes when you're reading texts about Egypt, you're watching videos, whatever, you're going to see history divided into three broad time periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom. 3,000 years of history there. That is pretty phenomenal. The ancient Egyptians, like most civilizations of their era, were polytheistic. They believed in many, many different gods. As we said, the ruling pharaoh was says here, seen as the living son of Ra, the sun god, and as such was not only the chief political leader, but the chief religious leader as well. Temples were everywhere in ancient Egypt, and many of their monumental structures were religious in nature. We've got some gods here, and you can read about them. You don't necessarily need to know them moving forward. You need to know that they had a lot of them. They represented different things. But to the Egyptians, their religious beliefs, and specifically their beliefs about the afterlife, really dictated almost everything that they did. Everybody knows the pyramids. Definitely the most famous of monumental architecture that Egypt had to offer, and arguably any civilization of the era had to offer. But do you know the purpose of these pyramids? Think about it. They're not just for show. The pyramids were essentially tombs for pharaohs, built mainly during Egypt's Old Kingdom. These were monuments to celebrate these fallen god kings. Within these tombs would be everything that a pharaoh would need in life, medicines and weapons and gold and things that the Egyptian people thought might serve the pharaoh in the afterlife. The pyramid in the middle pictured here, the Great Pyramid at Giza, would be the tallest building in the world for the next 3,800 years. Who built them? Likely conscripted laborers. The Egyptians did have slaves, and it's possible that they were built in part via slave labor, but this was conscripted labor. Egyptian citizens who were required to work on projects such as these for a certain time of year. Why would they do this? Well, some of that comes down to their beliefs. If the president, any president, asked you to come out and work on something like this as a citizen, well, in our modern day ideas and sentiments, we'd probably say no. But the Egyptians viewed their pharaohs as more than just men. They were gods. And once again, that's the benefit of having your people think of you as something otherworldly. We have pictured here the temples at the pyramids at Giza. In the upper left-hand corner, we have Abu Simbel, a temple for Ramses the Great, carved literally into the side of a mountain. In the lower right-hand corner, we have the enigmatic Sphinx, sort of protector, carved from one single piece of stone. And then we have the obelisk, which is essentially a giant sundial. Monumental architecture. You see it in most ancient civilizations, but perhaps none as famous as what we see out of Egypt. The rulers of ancient Egypt were called pharaoh. That would be a title given to kings and queens. Egypt was a monarchy, as each pharaoh inherited absolute power, usually from his father. However, Egypt was also a theocracy, as the pharaoh was also the chief religious leader. There are many pharaohs that ruled in ancient Egypt, and all tried to leave an eternal legacy. Of the many mighty pharaohs that ruled, only a few have actually accomplished such a goal. Those that have achieved this status have done so through luck, as most of the tombs have been destroyed or robbed. These unfortunate circumstances have left many holes in Egyptian history, life, and culture. I've compiled a list here of some of the most notable pharaohs. There's obviously thousands of years to work with here, but these are the ones that I think are worth knowing. You have Menes, the first pharaoh crowned around 3000 BCE, uniting Upper and Lower Egypt. Khufu, the Great Pyramid at Giza that we saw in the previous picture, it was built for him. Hatshepsut, the first female pharaoh. Ancient Egypt was patriarchal, but to a much lesser extent than most civilizations of the time. Women in ancient Egypt had many more rights, such as the right to divorce, the right to inherit property, and in this case, even the right to rule. Not a whole lot of female pharaohs, but it wasn't completely unheard of. Akhenaten tried to convert Egyptian religion to monotheism, centered on the worship of a kind of alternate sun god Aten. Tutankhamun, King Tut. King Tut is one of the more well-known pharaohs, but it wasn't so much for anything that he did in his life. It was for what he did in his death. His tomb wasn't discovered until, I believe, the early 20th century. And while other tombs that had been discovered in the years since had long since been pillaged, King Tut's tomb was left undisturbed. It looked just the way it had when he was put in it thousands of years ago. Ramses II, one of the more famous Egyptian rulers, probably the figure kind of characterized in the Bible's book of Exodus, built more than just about any pharaoh, had countless offspring, expanded the empire greatly, well known for a variety of things. Alexander the Great, not really usually associated with the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, but he was one. When he conquered Egypt many, many years ago, he crowned himself pharaoh on the way to conquering what was then the Persian Empire. It's worth noting that all the pharaohs that would come after Alexander the Great are not actually Egyptian. They're the descendants of one of Alexander's generals, Ptolemy. So all of them not really Egyptian, more so Greek, including the last, I guess you could say, independent pharaoh of ancient Egypt, Cleopatra. As we've stated, the Egyptians had very intricate beliefs about the afterlife. To them, this was something equal in experience and complexity to life here on Earth. And in the belief that they may somehow need their bodies, in the afterlife, the Egyptians mummified their dead. Now, this was a very lengthy and expensive process, so not all Egyptians had the actual mummification process done. But through the process, the Egyptians, they learned a lot about anatomy. They were removing organs, they were preserving body parts, and it led them to have a lot more knowledge about human physiology than most other people at the time. The writing of ancient Egypt, also a very early written language, hieroglyphics. Now, it was not that there wasn't other scripts, there were, but this is the sort of language that they would use to decorate the tombs of their dead, especially pharaohs, providing a sort of instructional guide for the afterlife, full of spells and incantations. Our next civilization lies further to the east. It's a mysterious civilization. It is, much like Mesopotamia, a group of civilizations located in the same basic region on the Indian subcontinent, near modern-day India and Pakistan, the various groups that lived in the Indus River Valley. The Indus River Valley civilization is really a group of independent city-states. The most famous two are known as Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. You need to know that these names are essentially synonymous with the Indus River Valley. Frankly, compared to a lot of the other civilizations that we've been discussing, we don't know that much about the Indus River Valley. That is because while they had a written language, no one has ever really been able to decipher it. We don't have much as far as historical records because, again, we don't know what they say. But based on the evidence left behind, we can draw some conclusions. To start off with, look at the pictures on the slide. If nothing else, we can say that the Indus River Valley inhabitants of places like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa They were expert urban planners. Look at the map in the left-hand side. Not really a map, an overhead photograph. You can see city streets. You can see that it's laid out in a sort of grid pattern that very similar to what we would use today. This shows a high level of organization, a high level of planning. We know that they had large bathhouses with running water. We know that they designed their buildings in such a way that they likely caught the natural airflow of the valley, kind of creating a natural air conditioning. We know that they had a sewer system, which was almost unheard of for the time. We know that there were seals that didn't belong there, seals that originated in Mesopotamia. So there must have been some communication, there must have been some trade between these two regions. We also know that they were likely the first to develop cotton textiles. What we don't know is how the civilization came to an end. Some say environmental degradation. Some say the river, the Indus River, due to perhaps earthquakes, changed its course. Some people believe that they were invaded and killed. There's not a lot of evidence of weapon making there, so perhaps they were a peaceful civilization or group of civilizations that encountered trouble that they couldn't handle. We do know, though, that about 500 years after the downfall of this civilization, a new group from Central Asia, the Aryans, invaded and essentially replaced or combined with the indigenous culture. It was with this Indo-Aryan group that we see the belief systems outlined in the Vedas that would eventually combine with local beliefs to form the foundation of Hinduism, the most popular religion in the Indian subcontinent to this day. The last of the Afro-Eurasian groups that we're going to talk about is the one that's more or less still around. The longest lasting continuous civilization in all of human history, that of ancient China. Now, they weren't known as China at this point. That doesn't come until the later Qin dynasty. But this is the same foundational culture that persists to this day. Much like the Indus and Mesopotamia and Egypt, they center around a river in their origins. The Yellow River, also known as the Yangtze. And the first recognized ruling party, I guess you could say, in this case a family, were known as the Shang. Now, we're just going to scratch the surface of Chinese civilization because unlike the other ones, China never goes away. We're going to return to East Asia, to China, throughout the entire class. So some of the stuff that we're going to just gloss over here, we will go into more depth on later on. So the story of China really starts with the Shang dynasty. Dynasty is just a family of rulers. And the Shang family were the first to really establish a unified rule and advanced civilization in the region. Legend has it that there was an earlier dynasty, the Xia dynasty, but most historians consider this to be myth. The Shang consolidated control with their use of chariots, with their bronze weapons, with their overall organization and advanced technology. Back before you had Taoism and Buddhism and other Chinese belief systems that would grow dominant. Buddhism is not actually Chinese, but it's very popular there. you had a sort of combination of beliefs. They were polytheistic before, Taoism and Buddhism and Confucianism really became very popular. They had animistic belief systems in nature and in various spirits. They also heavily practiced something known as ancestor veneration. The Chinese believed that their ancestors watched over them. And while I don't think ancestor worship would be quite appropriate, they definitely honored their ancestors and wanted to not bring any sort of shame on their family name. One thing that developed to allow the ancient Chinese to speak with their ancestors were the use of oracle bones. On the left-hand side, we have a bone. It may be like a hip bone, an ox bone, a turtle shell. They use a lot of different things. But essentially, the ancient Chinese would consult a shaman of sort who would inscribe, different characters into these shells or bones. The shaman would then heat up a pin and drive it through the bone. And based on the crack pattern that was made, they believed that they could interpret messages from the beyond. This was not only an important part of Chinese tradition, but it also was probably the foundation of their written language. On the right-hand side, you see something very important to Chinese history, something for many years no one else in the world knew how to make: silk. This secret of silk manufacturing would become legendary. It would be something that the Chinese protected as much as they could. And eventually, the desire for silk and other luxury goods is really what connected them to more Western civilizations. After all, it was the later Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire that developed the massive trade network that would become known as the Silk Roads. Throughout the majority of Chinese history, all the way up until the very early 20th century, China was ruled by a succession of families or dynasties. After the Shang fell, a new dynasty took over, the Zhou, in 1029 BCE. And in order to justify why they had overthrown the Shang, they instituted a belief that pretty much every dynasty afterwards would use to justify why the previous dynasty was overthrown. We call this the mandate of heaven. So the idea is the heavens, the gods, they choose who should be in charge of China. And if things are going good and the economy is flourishing and the people are well fed and the emperors behave in a respectful and devout manner, then they will retain the right to rule. But when the gods are displeased, you're going to see some bad stuff. You're going to see famine. You're going to see drought. You're going to see riots. You're going to see uprisings. And whoever manages to seize control, they will then have the mandate of heaven. Again, it's kind of strange, but it goes back in line to that idea that we spoke about earlier. Early rulers associating themselves with the gods to justify their rule. The final groups we're going to talk about, we're not going to spend a lot of time on. They are civilizations that started a little bit later than these Afro-Eurasian civilizations. They learned agriculture later. They've got a lot of differences, and they are the civilizations in the Americas, the Olmec in Mesoamerica, and the Chavan in South America. A couple basic things, though, and I would write these down because they're definitely worth remembering. And these are essentially true all the way up until 500 years ago, when European explorers started to show up in 1492, the first of which was Christopher Columbus. For what the Native American civilizations had to work with, they were incredibly advanced. But you're going to notice that these civilizations look quite a bit different than the ones that we will see growing up in Africa and Europe and Asia in the years moving forward. I'd already said they learned agriculture, a little bit later. But there's some things that they did not have that really prevented them from advancing to being very, very large, very, very advanced. First, reason number one, worth writing down. They didn't have any large pack animals for farming or transport. They don't have horses. They don't have oxen. They don't have cattle. They've got buffalo, but they're not domesticated. They've got alpacas and things like that, but they can only help so much. Again, without animal power, without horses and cattle and so on and so forth, there's only so much trade and transportation that's going to take place. There's only so much building materials that can be moved. There's only so many lots that can be farmed. So that puts them at a distinct disadvantage. All those large pack animals don't come until the late 1400s. Next, even when we get to 1492, the natives of the Americas are still essentially in the Stone Age. Now, while they did learn to melt down gold and silver for jewelry and whatnot, not much in the way of metal tools and weapons. They were still using stone and bone and wood, and in places like Central America, obsidian, volcanic glass. They had tools and weapons, but not to the same degree as what we will see in the Old World. They also never invented the wheel. Now, while you will see round calendars, and obviously they knew what the shape was, they never applied it towards any sort of transportation. And with those things that they were lacking, no large animals, still essentially being in the Stone Age, and really lacking wheeled technology, what they were able to accomplish, pretty amazing. Again, the Olmec and the Chavin we're not going to talk much about. I just need you to know that these are the prototype foundational civilizations of the area. And we will refer back to these guys because when we get into some future groups in Latin America, people like the Maya and the Aztec, and in South America, the Inca, a lot of their ideas, a lot of their technology, a lot of their achievements are really rooted in these older civilizations that came before them. Really, the oldest American civilization were the Olmec. Really came about in about 1500 BCE. They were located in Mesoamerica, the southern part of Mexico, parts of Central America. Again, they're going to be big influences to the Maya, the Toltec, the Aztec, among others. One of the things that they were really known for was the monolithic architecture that they left behind. In this case, large stone heads, possibly of rulers, maybe of gods. These were large stone heads, 10 feet tall, thousands of pounds, carved out of a single block of stone. I bring this up because not only are pretty much all ancient civilizations known for the monumental architecture they created, and a lot of that architecture is related to religion, but another thing that is really served by those creations is, man, you build something like this, your civilization builds something like this, it's a projection of power. It projects power, it projects influence, it intimidates people. For a leader that's maybe struggling to legitimize their authority, building a stone head, building a pyramid, those pieces of architecture can do just that. A lot of the things that you see associated with Mesoamerican, Latin American, Native American civilizations really start with the Olmec. They were America's first pyramid builders. They had a polytheistic belief system that will influence nearly all the civilizations that come after them in Mesoamerica at least. They practiced human sacrifice, believing it was a debt that they owed to their gods. This is something you also see in many of the Latin American civilizations before Columbus. Some of you guys have maybe seen in a movie or TV show this sort of ancient ball game called ulama in some cultures. Again, pretty intricate. These different teams, they bounce a rubber ball off their hips into a stone hoop. The winners or losers, depending on your interpretation, may be sacrificed to the gods. Again, as we talk more in depth about people like the Maya and the Aztec, you're going to see that a lot of their ideas really are based on what the Olmec had done. The final group we're going to discuss, and we're going to discuss them just barely, are the Chavín of South America. Located high up in the Andes Mountains, this civilization began to flourish around 1200 BCE. And a lot of their characteristics are due to the fact that they had to adapt to life in the mountains. They didn't have much in the way of pack animals. They had the llama, which, isn't really an animal you can ride. So, travel was mainly done on foot. But even with that, even with the lack of pack animals, I mean, they were experts at building with stone. Again, they adapted to what they were given, adapted to their high altitude. They grew potatoes and quinoa and things of that nature because they could flourish in such altitudes. One of the things, though, that they developed, which is pretty interesting, is the concept of quipu. If you look in the left-hand corner, you will see a lady with a series of knotted strings. The Chavín, and later the arguably more famous Inca, for as advanced as they were, they never developed written language. But they did have a method of record keeping, sort of memory aids. Kind of complicated, but they would use a series of knotted strings of different colors and different combinations to kind of trigger their memory and record certain transactions, events. Pretty phenomenal, being able to do that and actually keep track of things and achieve what they achieved without, the advent of writing. Again, we will refer to the Chavín and the Olmec later on as we go more in depth into some of the more famous civilizations that came after them. But for right now, if you know that they are around during this time period and they serve as the foundation for a lot of what comes later, I think you'll be okay. And that is it. Clearly, I lied because this presentation is a little bit longer than the last one, but there was a lot to unpack here, guys. Highly recommend you watch the videos that I have underneath this particular video. I think that they'll give you a greater understanding, a greater appreciation for some of the things that we have talked about. We will see you guys soon.